Right.
Right. Well, welcome everybody to a session of which the honorary chief speaker is sitting on my left, and it's Renée Hirschon, whom you all know, and we'll have the opportunity to give her a big hand a bit later, but why not now? So, welcome to Renée Hirschon, the main speaker today, and the author of these books, which all of you have read already, but if you haven't, there are copies out there which are for sale. That's Heirs of the Greek Catastrophe and Crossing the Aegean, with the latter edited by Renée.
Can I add that it's a magnificent discount?
Tremendous stuff. It's an unrepeatable opportunity. And I will take advantage of it because my copies of the book are the earlier editions or the earlier edition. We have on the panel, besides Renée herself, Professor Robin Cohen from Kellogg College, Oxford, and Basak, Kale, is that the correct pronunciation? Thank you very much. Who will be chiming in after Renée speaks. I'm Michael Llewellyn-Smith. I'm an alumnus of St. Antony's College, and both Renée and myself were taught by a distinguished former fellow of the college, John Campbell, great anthropologist, but also he turned into an impressive historian also. So I remember him on an occasion like this, as I'm sure you do too. Others present, I think you all know, David Madden, old colleague of mine in the diplomatic service, but doing valiant service here for St. Antony's. Julie Adams, and I wanted to mention also Marilena Anastatopoulou, who is an expert who I don't know whether she'll be asking questions or speaking later. I hope so, because she knows an awful lot about what we're going to be talking about. You've seen the paper sent round in advance, so I don't think there's any need for further introductions now. I should have mentioned Arthur, of course, who will be speaking, if not during this session, afterwards, as I know, and who is an essential component of it. I've been told that we on the panel should speak up because of those who are tuning into Zoom, because otherwise we won't be heard. I went to a Zoom session 2 days ago by a distinguished historian, and found it impossible to hear what was being said until question time. And the reason was that with question time, the speaker tends to look up from his notes and speak clearly and loudly, and it can be heard by everybody. So can we all please do that so that we are heard? I'd like to ask David Madden and Julie if they have any further technical instructions before we proceed further.
Technical instructions is not my field.
Not your field. Julie?
She's next door.
Next door. Okay, so we take it there aren't any further instructions. The structure of the session will be that after I've done this brief introduction, Renée will speak and also show us some photographs from whatever source. And then the two speakers on my right will come in, Professor Cohen and Basak. And then there'll be time for questions. I don't know how long, it depends on how long the speakers take. But it should be time for all of you who wish to ask a question to get it in and get an answer. So just one or two thoughts before we move on. First of all, congratulations to Renée on this third edition of her book. It really is a milestone. I've revisited the earlier edition, as I told her, with great pleasure and profit in the last few days. One need hardly say how much migration questions are, I won't say popular, but necessary in today's world. And this is an early example of a groundbreaking book about migration and the consequences of migration. For instance, I see that there's going to be a seminar on the 31st of October chaired by Arthur on migration and the dehumanization of refugees. I just mentioned that as an example of how it's everywhere with us, the migration question. So come and listen to that on the 31st. Second, I want to give a plug also to the book which Renée edited, Crossing the Aegean, which consists of essays by a large number of experts about the questions which we are addressing and which Renée dealt with in her earlier book. She edited this, and the two introductory sections are a very useful tracing of what it's all about. Crossing the Aegean with participants and writers and speakers from Greece, from Turkey, and from other countries. So that's enough from me. And I'm going to turn to you, Renée, and ask you to speak.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand up largely because of what you said about the Zoom effect. And I hope that it means that my voice will be more audible. And if not, please let me know if it isn't. Thank you very much for turning up to this event, which has been long in the making, and in the end proved to be unavoidable due to some health problems that I've had. It was really sort of touch and go about whether I'd be able to come this evening to talk to you. And consequently, I have cut down my talk quite radically from what it was beforehand, which means there might well be some gaps that you'd like to fill up in the Q&A. And please do feel that that's the time to clarify things. So what I want to do is start off with the context and the important information which are in the next two slides. Now, I'm going to see if this is going to work. Okay, this is the one that I want to draw attention to. Why is it not coming up on the?
I don't know why it might not be working, but maybe I'll just do it
Right.
here whenever you want.
Okay. The important thing to note here is that place names, in anthropology, there is a convention which is to preserve confidentiality of the places you study. And consequently, in my first work, I didn't use the actual names of the places where I lived. So I used the term, let me just see, Nea Ephesos for Kokinia and Ornikia, and I used the term Urania for Germanica. And those are the two actual names of the places which are used now, obviously, because my work's moved on, time has moved on, and this confidentiality ethic actually is also changing in anthropology. But in my day, which is ages ago, it was definitely something that you had to be careful about. Now the next one, please. This slide shows you the picture of the metropolis of Athens, in which the refugee settlements established about 100, just under 100 years ago, had already been embedded in the metropolis. And so you can barely see where the original settlements are located. This is taken 50 years after the influx of the refugees. And I will show you in a moment, I'll show you a picture of the original settlement of Germanica. Next one, please. Right, this is a actually very important orienting point. You have mentioned, Michael, thank you, the importance of migration studies. But I have to point out that I have no intention of conducting a study of refugees. In 1972, refugees were not a topic for discussion. They were not important. And in fact, worldwide, there were only 3.5 million forcibly displaced people, which is quite extraordinary. And if you look at the graph carefully, you'll see where it starts peaking. And you will notice that in 2016, there were 60 million. In 2020, that's 4 years later, it had gone up to 80 million. And as of the most recent figures, it's over 100 million refugees and increasing literally, as you know, because of what's happening, it's increasing on a daily level. So nowadays, migration is a study, and it's of crucial importance. So it's been a challenge to me to try and say to myself, what is the value of the work I did 50 years ago in terms of contemporary conditions? Can we learn anything from the experience of the people who were displaced forcibly in the early 1920s? And is it at all relevant for our experience today? And I hope I'll be able to just flag up some of the points there. Okay, next one, thank you. So that was the, it was the original settlement of Germanica. Germanica is a discrete neighborhood within Kokinia, characterized by its housing. And the housing was what made it an ideal laboratory for what I was interested in. And my interest had to do with the interaction between the use of space and cultural values. And don't think that every culture is the same. They are highly different in the way in which they arrange domestic arrangements and arrangements outside of the house. But as you can see from that side, that particular settlement, which is in the north area of the original refugee settlement, abuts onto pretty well open land, and which is now highly built up, as you saw in the overview of the area. Okay, next one, thank you. Now, this is a picture taken when I was doing my work living in that area. of the two of the main roads, which were paved and led straight to the port of Piraeus. And it all looks very respectable and, you know, quite well kept. But let me tell you, that was not the whole reality. I can just point out that in the slide on the right, there's washing hanging on the pavements, the kukureludas, as they call, which are little carpets that people use, indicates that these were crowded houses. There wasn't enough space to hang your washing in the yard of the house, because right from the beginning, the original provisions were not adequate. There were too many people to be housed in rather small plots and very small houses. And the consequence was that these houses became subdivided. And you'll see some indications later on. So we have the paved streets leading to the harbour, but there's a lack of infrastructure. There was no central sewage. There was a communal cesspool for every 4 plots, and that had to be emptied by contracting a private contractor who came around whenever, once a month or whatever was necessary, and emptied the cesspool and took it away. The schools were overcrowded. The schools had to take different shifts during the day. So there'd be a morning shift and an afternoon shift. And teachers were highly perplexed about how to deal with the large numbers of children in the classes. Couldn't keep control. And there's one incident which I mentioned in my book about a boy who was able to pay truant for about 2 months because nobody noticed he wasn't there. And he was having a great time with his mates. They were going down to the sea and going to cinemas and so on. And he forged an excuse with his father's help. I mean, there was a bit of connivance after he was found in order to save the family's reputation. It was quite an interesting illustration of family solidarity and how you bend the rules if you need to. Okay, next one, please. So I said to you, that wasn't the whole picture. And this is a picture of what was happening in most of the, if not all of the side streets leading into the main roads. And as you can see, there's no drainage. So if it rained, there was mud. People were having to try and keep the houses clean in the face of great odds. And again, this is something which impressed me immensely. Because before this, I'd been living in Chicago in the South Side, and there were very good buildings, but it was a slum. It was very badly kept. And here were very bad buildings, and it was very clean. In fact, one of the subtitles is called Spotless Slums. They were, and people took care of them. So women and their daughters would go out and sweep the streets in the afternoons to keep the dust down. And I was given how can I say this, accolade. People were very proud of the fact that I'd learned how to be a proper refugee, which means sweeping the streets outside your house. Right, so the next section, I want to read to you something. Let's go to okay. What I'd like to do in this presentation is to read to you 2 anecdotes which have not been published, and it's what I would call behind the scenes. So this idea of behind the scenes is that in my book, I mentioned this in the sort of third person, of one of the kindly residents was very concerned about my unmarried state. And I could tell you even more details if I needed to. She was so concerned that she found me a suitable husband, potential husband. So her particular case is important to know about. She did not have daughters, and her affection for me was partly attributable to that gap. One day she told me she wanted to introduce me to a well-established, available man. And she told me he was an industrialist. In Greek, that's a biomekanos, which it sounds really posh, actually. He owned a tailoring workshop producing men's shirts. There were 5 local girls who were his employees, a common pattern in the economic life of the locality. I've described that in my book. There's a whole thing about the economics of these local artisan workshops. It assured me not to worry, because she decided to provide me with her house, as my dowry. It was a very delicate situation, as you can imagine, and I had to make excuses in order to avoid the introductory meeting, because once you go that far, you can't actually get out without creating some bad feeling among the people if you turn them down. So my excuse, which was justifiable, was that I was a student and that I would first finish my studies before we could embark on matchmaking for me. So that was actually saved the face all around. The other sort of behind the scenes thing, which I haven't mentioned, is but I should highlight this. In 1970, Greece was in the grips of a military occupation. There was a very oppressive military regime, and conditions were very uncomfortable. And I had to be particularly careful because I'd taken up residence in an area known to be of left-wing resistance tendencies. And it was highly known for that reason. And because of that, I was warned by people that I was going to be under surveillance. So I made friends with a younger couple who lived quite close to the north end of Llewellyn-Smith. And they said to me, "We are involved in resistance, but we don't want you to know anything about it. And just listen to what we tell you to do, if necessary." So I thought, okay, this is some kind of warning, and doing it for my good. And lo and behold, just before Easter that year, I got a message from Laura saying, "Go away for the holidays, spend some time outside of your money car." And lo and behold, the statue of a previous dictator called METU was blown up on the square. And the very next day, the plainclothes policemen were at my door. I wasn't there, but they asked the neighbors, "Where's this foreign woman? Where's she gone?" And they said, "Oh, we don't know, she's not here, she hasn't been here for days." So I was quite, again, well served by people caring for me under conditions which were very difficult at the time. And partly because of that reason, my initial study did not take into account much of the political life of the area. I returned in 1983 and did some more work on the electoral results. And I also updated it in my new preface. There's quite a chunky bit on the local context, which describes the conditions within the area during the Civil War, afterwards, and as a result of the freeing up of the regime in what is called the METU, the post-dictatorship period. Okay, next one, please. Okay, this is a sort of section that a lot of my new preface has to do with these two themes, change and continuity. And it's a large chunk of the preface. So I'm just choosing a few things to illustrate elements of the change and continuity. So next one. Now this is a theme, it's an absolute, how can I say, injunction in such areas to be sociable. To be unsociable is highly undesirable. It becomes a sort of social pressure to sit outside on the pavement, to make yourself known, to know what's going on in the neighborhood through these contacts. So I took part in a lot of these afternoon pavement gatherings. It wasn't only the women, men could also join in. And it was typical that somebody would walk past and somebody whose pavement it was would say, would you like a coffee? There's cafe. And then they'd bring a chair out and you'd sit down and join into the company. So it went on and on. I don't know if they do it in Turkey.
Yeah, this looks similar. It's the same. I feel home right now.
Okay, so yeah. So this is sociability. What slide number is that?
Well, I'm afraid I don't know.
You haven't got it?
No, I'm afraid.
Okay. Sorry, there are technical issues about this presentation which could not be solved. We're quite lucky to have it happening anyway because it really wasn't a power presentation. Unpaved streets. Next one, please. Oh, this is a rather historic and quite a moving picture of the room in the house that I rented. So it's that little upper floor and the basement with a kind of wonky bit of iron over it. The basement was the kitchen, and my upper room was the room I lived in. And that was shared with an elderly couple who were my landlord and landlady, and who had 4 sons. So the 4 sons were no longer resident because in that locality, the dowry that you provided was to the daughters, and the daughters were given housing, but the sons had to move out because they got housing elsewhere. So on the right-hand side is what happened to my landlord and landlady's property, which was owned by the 4 sons, and it was rebuilt as a 5-story apartment block. And that was in 2008. So I'm trying to provide you with an indication of changes through time without it being systematic. This was not a systematic study. It's impressionistic, and it was based on frequent visits back to my neighborhood and to see people that I knew, and just to see how they were getting on. Right, next one, please. Now, this is another interesting change and continuity. Here you have on the left the situation when I lived there, the black and white picture where, again, people sitting outside their houses to be sociable. There's only one car, if you notice that, highly unusual having a car, the unpaved road. And then fast forward, the same street and the same house has got now a tiled orange roof. There are more cars, and the street has been paved. There are also signs of small construction, a 3-story building a bit further on that same street. So on the one hand, when I went back to find my own house, it was in an area that was unrecognizable. I could not find my own house and had to ask where number 268 Saldari was. But in this case, you could still identify what had been there beforehand and what were the changes as they are in 2008. Okay, next one, please. Now, I'm going to read to you actually from my book, largely because it's got to do with statistics, and I didn't want to feel like writing it up again and making a slide. So what is changing here is demography. In the beginning, there was a relatively homogeneous population because it was planned to provide for those displaced by the 1923 population exchange. The locality had always offered low-cost accommodation, and in recent years, it attracted new immigrants, resulting in great demographic diversity. Now, this is where the figures come into it. In 2001, for example, 6,000 persons from 83 different countries declared their foreign origin. And that was at a time when that was 7% of the population, when the whole population of Coquigny was 93,000. Where did these people come from? Well, most of them came from the picture I got there, from Albania, 4.3%. And a large number were also from Balkans and Eastern European countries, more than 1%. Okay, official figures 10 years later were in the same kind of proportion, but even more. So at that time, the municipality had been conglomerated into a larger area through local government reforms. And there was a total of 10,000 foreign-born persons in a population of 105,000. So it's gone up to 10% within 11 years. And this time the immigrants were mostly from Eastern Europe, Albania, Ukraine, Russia, Moldavia, Georgia, and Armenia. Fortunately, I was going to say Greece has got its act together. They now have official census returns, so I could actually pinpoint where these people were from. While migrants from Pakistan and Egypt, next one, they constituted the next large numbers. So here we've got, as I was walking around the area, I noticed that one kind of housing had been rented out to migrant workers. Clearly, they were single men. On the right-hand side, you can see them with their mobile phones. And on the left-hand side, there are satellite dishes. How do I know they were Pakistani? Well, I went and asked the bakery officer. He said, oh, they're from Pakistan. They haven't got families here, and they don't want to stay. That was a different category. So what results from this is that there's a growing heterogeneity of population. And there are small diaspora groups now who are forming in parts of the whole conglomeration of Coquigny and its surrounding areas, of these people who are settling in either for temporary work or because they bought their own houses and want to. In fact, I have a lovely slide which I had to leave out, which is of the so there, just go back one. I think it's the children. Yes, that's right. Well, the interesting thing about them is they were speaking to me in Greek, and they go to a Greek school. And my question is, are they Greeks or Albanians? And what are they going to think of themselves as? So there's quite a different sort of dynamic in the population composition. Right, and final section, we're coming towards the end now. As I said at the beginning, I was quite perturbed to think, what can we actually, in the face of the crises that are existing now on a worldwide level, what can we learn from the people I live with? And the thing that I have written about, I think, quite responsibly, is my absolute admiration for the resilience and creativity that they showed in being able to reconstitute their lives in the face of a huge hiatus. They left their homes under traumatic conditions, and in the first wave of the expulsion, most of them have not able to take much with them. There were two phases to the expulsion, the compulsory exchange. In phase two, people in the interior of Cappadocia, mostly Turkish-speaking Christians, were given about a month or 2 months' notice and were told that they were allowed to leave and could sell a lot of what they had and accumulate some property and take it with them. And my landlady was one of those, although she came from Istanbul, she didn't actually come from Cappadocia, but she had brought with her some very fine little porcelain cups for her coffee, and a very nice large keelan, which she had managed to get through the customs or whatever. So the experience of the displaced peoples of the 1923 exchange was not similar or overall, and in fact, in Turkey, the distinction is made, I believe, quite clearly between the exchange peoples and between refugees. And in Greece, it's just become elided into one group of Asia Minor refugees. You know, they came in influx, huge numbers, and so on. I might just flag up that huge numbers, 1.5 million people were expelled from what was then the Ottoman Empire. And it constituted for the Greek state 1/4 of the population of the whole country. So if you add or try and compare it with England today, it's about 12 to 13 million people coming in within 2 years. And it's, you know, we complain about taking on what, 20,000 Ukrainians, and the country's too crowded. I remain speechless, actually. So there are three, what I thought of as coping mechanisms. And the important thing was the need to maintain continuity. So if I were to bold that, I underline continuity is the theme that people need to maintain. And they do this in various ways. It's also in the preface I talk about what these themes of continuity are. And one is in the emphasis on endogamy, that is marrying within your group. So you don't marry outsiders. And the interesting thing is that although when I lived there was very low, if any, 0 incidents of divorce, when I went back to visit my friends in the 2000s, I noticed that people were talking about their divorces, the young women who had been the daughters of my equivalent generation were now into second marriages or just being separated and divorced mothers of the children. So that, I think, relates quite well to the demographic diversity and the loosening up of what was happening there, but also to the Greek economy, which had started to take off in the period before 2010. And so women had much more choice about getting jobs than being employed. And the second element of narrative, which is, I've got the importance of narrative, it is par excellence the way in which you bridge the gap between the hiatus and disruption of being forced to leave your home. And you can, by talking about it, you create a memory bank of what life had been like before. So it allows people to adjust and not just simply drop into the kind of zero in which they had found themselves. There was no way in which they could orientate themselves easily. And so I also discovered that one of the other mechanisms they used was to reproduce their regional stereotypes. So people who came from Pontus had certain characteristics, and that explained why in that part of Coquignac it was very quiet and hardworking because the Pontic people were living there. People from Smyrna, which is where young Renée was, were quarrelsome and noisy, and consequently they were much more prone to those sorts of things. So people used stereotypes to create a continuity and identity for themselves. Okay, so I mentioned then that the importance of material objects is highlighted for those people who were allowed to collect their possessions before they left and to bring them with them. Even in the very first days of panic, when people were, literally running with their fee for their lives, they quite often would manage to bring a household icon or the icons from the churches, which they had to abandon. So the importance of the material objects, again, is one way in which you create a bridge between your life beforehand and afterwards. Right. Now I'm going to find, I don't know how you're going to help me with this. I've got a small video clip. The music is by Theodorakis, who some of you will know about, and it's sung in the Rebetiko style by Vithikotsis, who's a Rebetic, that's right. And if you look at the images, there'll be a lot of images that I couldn't show you in the PowerPoint, but that will illustrate to you what the locality was like and the people that I dealt with. The final one in this particular thing, it ends abruptly, was two of the heirs of the Greek catastrophe reading the Greek translation of Heirs. So the two elderly men, again, sitting outside on the pavement outside their house. So that's the continuity, and even into the next generation. So why don't we just listen to this little clip? It only lasts about 2 minutes. These are all the Turkish speaking categories.
Renée, thank you so much. You bring it all to life, and that's a difficult thing to do, and you really succeeded in that. And what you have said prompts all sorts of thoughts, which I hope will come out in some of the questions and maybe addresses of those on my right. The relevance of what you've described to what's going on, not just in Greece, but here and throughout Europe, not only Europe, but throughout the world. It's all there. And you started quite correctly by saying you were not studying refugees, but what you were studying prompts many thoughts about refugees too. And you brought that out in the later part of what you said. So let's continue until we get to question time, and then you will be in the hot seat again. I'm going to ask the two speakers, Professor Cohen and Basak, to introduce themselves briefly and then go straight into their presentation. They know much more about themselves than I know about them. So, Professor Cohen, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you very much. And David, if you could just indicate if I'm not getting my sound back to you. Thank you. So I'm Professor of Development Studies or Emeritus now, and work mainly in the field of refugees, diasporas and migration. So of course, I'm delighted to be here on this occasion to add a very small contribution to Renée's celebratory event. And I want to concentrate really just on two issues. One, the theme of urban ethnography, and two, the theme of displacement. So for those of you who haven't read the preface of the new edition, Renée makes a startling claim, which I'm sure must be correct. This may have been the very first urban ethnography ever published. And I thought, well, I couldn't think of another, so she must be correct in this. And often a modest scholar said, I think it's important perhaps to. Yes.
I have to say that comment is made by Michael Hirschon, who is a far more eminent anthropologist than I am, and it's in the preface to the second edition.
Okay, fine. Well, thank you for the correction. And in any event, it is an unusually interesting book for that reason. And the reason, the comment I want to make about urban ethnography in particular, and the strength of this particular account, is that anthropologists always have a great deal of difficulty drawing out wider relevance from their particular case study. So you have, if you like, a process of zooming in and zooming out. When you zoom in, you get greater detail, you get greater color, you get greater texture, and as we saw from those slides, a real sense of being in the personality and in the identity and in the social setting that the ethnography is taking place. But of course, what you also have a problem with is context. Why is this study important? Why is this place important? Why are the themes that I found of general relevance? And to do that, you have to zoom out again. And I think the great virtue of the book is that Renée moves in and out, so that you get, even in the short presentation that she gave us, the background of, the population exchange, the Greek political crisis, the fact that there was a military government at that time. So you get the sense of relevance and context together with the social detail and the sense in which you are there and part of that structure. So I think great congratulations to her in that respect. The second thing, which I want to spend a little bit more time on, is the issue of displacement. And of course, in this case, she is talking about a special case of displacement, or not a very special case of displacement. There are other examples as well, where there is in fact a population exchange. It's not simply a one-way movement. And as she pointed out, we're talking about, what is it, about 1.5 million people moving to Turkish Greece, and about 350,000 mainly Muslim people moving from Greece to Turkey. And I can recall actually, just autobiographically, this is in passing, when I was a young lad, watching something called British Movie Tone News, which was the sort of YouTube of its head. And it was, it must be a replay of the 1947 population exchange between India and Pakistan, which was the great event of the 20th century numerically. 15 million people in total moving one direction or the other. And it stuck in my mind for many, many years, watching a long line of people on the same road, so carrying a very minimal amount of possessions, with some with carts or donkeys, moving one direction and other not moving in the other direction. And it puzzled me as a child, and I think it created a kind of vivid image of what on earth is going on here, that people have to move in this way, and for what reason. And of course, we can now zoom out and understand what was happening. This was the way in which nationalism played out. That there was a space for every race, inverted commas around the word race, and that the things that we now call ethnic cleansing are all part of this great idea, which in the 19th century was associated through Lord Acton and others with a form of progressive form of politics, that people should escape empires and have their own nations. And now I think we can recognize that it's associated rather with more sinister politics. And what was at one point seemingly a benign rearrangement of peoples into natural groups is now becoming a much more threatening and obdurate problem, and we see it on our television screens at the moment. So, okay, so it's a special case of displacement, but I want to talk about displacement in general, and perhaps the word displacees, the expression displacees, is actually a rather better one than refugees, because refugees very often confines us into the idea of a legal instrument, a definition that surrounds 1951 convention, and perhaps as is indicated by the great difficulty the UNHCR has in compiling these statistics, distinguishing between internally displaced people and displaced at borders, between other people of concern, and when you add them up, you get these very large numbers that Renée already alluded to. So perhaps we need a more general category of displacees and displacement, and a recognition that we've moved well beyond the legal definitions associated with the Geneva Convention. And increasingly, what we are talking about is a common experience, driven by war, driven by famine, driven by political discrimination, driven by poverty, and now, of course, driven by climate change. And it's difficult to group all these people into one category, but it's better perhaps to understand it as a very general movement with some particular characteristics, which I want to go on and suggest to you the extent of this phenomenon and also its character. The reason why I want to expand in this way is because Renée's book is not only pioneering in respect of urban ethnography, but it's pioneering in beginning to understand the social psychology of displacement. I'm not a professional social psychologist, but I want to linger a little bit on this idea that what we need to address is what's going on in people's heads, in their minds, what's happening with the loss of place, with the estrangement of their sense, and what happens actually on both sides of the movement, of that population movement. And I want to just give three very rapid indications from three different settings. We're going to take more than a few minutes to do this, just to give you an illustration of the extent of this phenomenon. In Cape Verde, where I did some field work some time ago, there's a famous singer, Cesera Evora, and she sings something called the Mora, which is a lament. We know that from Ireland, we have Portugal, we know various other societies which have equivalent kinds of songs. And when asked to define the lament, Mora, she said, well, it's all about people feeling that they have to go and want to stay, or on the other hand, that they have to stay and want to go. So there is a rather interesting kind of juxtaposition of sentiments that is going on there. And that's the sort of Cape Verdean popular song, if you like. And the second illustration, how this concept of displacement is expanded, is a book that I read very recently. A colleague from Oxford, Ruba Johnson, has just produced a book on Malian traders in Senegal, and she asked me to write a little puff at the back of the book. That's us old folks that take together us to do these kinds of things. And this book is really about an urban development plan by a vainglorious Senegalese president to decide he would clean up the market area and get these market traders, mainly women, out of the way. And so the bulldozers came in, and these market women were displaced. They lost their homes, their families, their trading, and they tried to reconstitute themselves on the edge of this, finding little cracks and crannies in those little spaces, a bit like some of your side streets, I suspect. And the story is about urban development as a form of displacement. So not really refugees in the sort of convention sense at all. And the final example, perhaps, a most interesting paper by a Nigerian scholar called Semadon Olayaluwa in the last issue of Diaspora, a journal published in the States. And he's invented a new term entirely, which he calls extalgia, which is the kind of sort of riff on nostalgia, but felt on behalf of the people who stayed behind. And this is a very interesting idea, that people who stayed behind are also in a sense involved in loss and estrangement. They feel abandoned, they feel neglected, they often feel rather second rate because the people who have left have often been sponsored by the community or by their family, as seen as promising people to go and send remittances back or to find or seek their fame and fortune. So if you like, all of these people are being drawn into this idea, or if you like, an expanded idea of displacement. So back now to Renée, if I may. So not only have we got a pioneering urban ethnography, but we've also got a book that begins to understand the wider expressions and manifestations of displacement, which now becomes not merely an exotic thing that happens to some people, but essentially things that are happening to lots of people, including us. We are feeling very often out of place, out of sorts, not able to connect our identity to our place of residence, to our place of birth, and so on, and feeling those kinds of contradictions. So what I wanted to do really is to just say thank you to Renée for producing a book that feeds into this wider debate that is emerging around the idea of displacement.
Thank you very much. Oh, great, thank you. We move on to Basak. And if you would like also to sort of introduce yourself and then tell us whatever you would like to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kale. I'm an associate professor of international relations in Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Turkey. I was also the former head of European studies there, and also the coordinator of migration studies program. So basically, taking on all the angles here. And I'll be talking a little bit more about crossing the Aegean, so the other side of the story basically, and the link between Renée's book and what actually happened on the other side. It's actually an expression. Anybody who's a Turkish speaker here? You can understand. So we have an expression in Turkish that says from the other side of the water being the Aegean. Suyun öteki yarısı. So it's an expression basically explaining that if a person is slightly different in Turkey, in the sense more secular, a bit more European, a bit more open-minded, clean, organized. So that means that they're from the other side of the world, the other side of the Aegean. So it's quite interesting in that regard. These exchanges are not very organized and clean, and it seems to be having similar kind of traits. So I'm going to tell the story on this side of the water in that regard. In 1998, 1999, it's going to tell my age, but I was doing a master's degree at LSE, and I was sitting in the economics class with this guy who's obviously Greek because he had a very thick accent, and he was, you can tell. And he asked me where I'm from, and knowing that he's Greek, I said I'm from the other side of the water. He found that this expression is extremely threatening. And apparently told all the Greek friends that this girl told me that she's from the other side. I didn't mean it in that way. It was just an expression that we would use. In September 1999, I lost that friend. He died in an accident. And I was devastated, being in his early 20s. How can somebody can die? This is so unfair, because the world was a beautiful place then, and suddenly it wasn't. During my very depressed moments, my mom gave me a book and said, you better read this book. It was from Yaşar Kemal, a Turkish author who definitely deserved a Nobel Literature Prize, and he wrote from it. And it was an island story. It says, look, the Euripides is red with blood. It's Fransız kanatlı baksana in Turkish. So it was basically a story about Poyraz Musa, a character who was a war hero, and he fought in the wars by the end of the Ottoman Empire and the Independence War in different parts, in different, places. And he has seen the horrors of the war with the Russian invasion, aggression, as we call it, the 93 war, which is the 78 war with Russia in the east, in the south, everywhere, in the Dardanelles. So he moves to an island, which is called an imaginary island in the Dardanelles. And it's a deserted island because all the Greek population in the island in 1924 has been moved to Greece. And there's only 1 or 2 people living in the island, and he finds refuge in that island. There's only one person left in the island that was Greek, an old Greek lady who's still looking forward his son to come from the war, and she refused to leave. Her name was Lena, and she escaped from the compulsory population exchange and hid in the stables when the soldiers came to rescue, move her. My friend's mother's name was Lena too. So this woman is waiting for the son, and it just kind of felt very close to home. And the whole story is a very pastoral story. Unfortunately, it's not translated into English, it's only translated into Italian. And it's a 4-volume book that continues with the story. And then it just showed the horrors of war, the horrors of, how the history was being built, and the human side of this whole story. It was about a shared compassion, basically, between the enemies. So it was something surprising for me, because we as Turks never considered this population exchange as a humanitarian tragedy, basically. It was a humanitarian disaster. It was just a legalistic kind of issue. Lausanne Treaty is there, 1923. It was a resolution of the Independence War. And for those of you to be able to understand the origins of the population exchange, we have to go back to 1920, which is the Sèvres Treaty, the end of the First World War. And then the signature of the Sèvres Treaty, basically, with the Allied powers, meant that it is the partition of the Ottoman Empire. The Italians, British Empire, in certain strategic locations, the French, and also Brits. So this partition obviously sparked the independence movement by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and started the independence war and resulted with the Lausanne Treaty. For the history of the Turkish Republic, by the way, in 4 days, going to be 100 years of the Turkish Republic, 29th of October, is basically marked by the Lausanne Treaty as a victory treaty. So this is something very positive. And the population exchange attached, the protocol measure attached to the Lausanne Treaty, have always been considered as a legal topic, not necessarily a political topic. It was just a legal topic of population exchange, and it was accepted like that. So with this background, it was quite an unfamiliar topic for the Turkish audience to read about the humanitarian side of population exchange. It was a legal topic that the lawyers dealt with, historians dealt with. It's happened, it's not. It was a taboo topic in that regard. Like we're talking about numbers of 1.2 to 1.5 Greeks coming to Turkey, and about 400 to 600,000 Greeks moving to Greece. We're talking about approximately more than 2 million people exchanging. But surprisingly enough, for the Turkish part of this issue, this was mostly not forgotten, but it's a topic that you don't want to touch upon. You don't want to mention that you were an exchangee in that regard. We have an expression in Turkish called muhacir, not necessarily meaning refugees, not necessarily meaning an immigrant. Muhacir basically means, mostly covers the exchangee. And as I mentioned, if you're walking through, if you're going through the car, I remember from my childhood, if you pass through a village which was whitewashed, very clean, organized, my father would say, "Oh, Muhacir village." And I would say, "How would you know? Like, how would you know the ethnic origin of the person while you're just crossing it? Because it's different." And over time, you became a trained eye, and then you're crossing the village, which is clean, organized, it's out, a Muhacir village. And the Muhacir doesn't necessarily, in that regard, meaning ethnically a Turkish person. So that was the other side of the story. So this is exactly why Dr. Hirschon's book on the Heirs of the Greek Catastrophe was in that time, in terms of research and scope and focus, came at the right time in the Turkish literature, in that research and literature, because it's the 2000s where we decided to think about the issue of identity, belonging, homeland, and the social and psychological aspects of being part of the nation. So this nation building process, though, and I'm putting a parenthesis here, the nation building, after reading, I had Crossing the Aegean and start reading it. And this kind of lit my first initial thoughts about Yaşar Kemal's book, and then seeing the more human and social part of the issue made me wonder more about the topic. So I did more research. Why it happened? How did it happen? How does this come into being? Because although it sounded very organized in the legal terms on paper, what happened in reality was a complete disaster on both sides. Not only for the Greeks, the book is called the Greek Catastrophe, but it was also a catastrophic event for the people who came to Turkey as well, not necessarily one-way streets in that regard. Because it was a nation building process's end result in that regard, starting from the early beginning of the 19th century, the rise of nationalism in the Balkans resulted with the creation of the Serbian states, followed by the Greek state, Bulgarian state, and the exodus of lots of Muslims from these nation states, not necessarily Turkish, to the Ottoman mainland. Because of the whole idea of the millet system. For those of you who are not familiar with the millet system, Ottoman Empire sociological structure was based on religious groupings. And there was a hierarchy as well, the Greek Orthodox being on the top of this hierarchy. So in this hierarchy, sorry, the Muslims obviously, but after the Muslims, the social and religious grouping was followed by the Greek Orthodox, followed by the other Christians, and on the very bottom was the Jews. And this kind of what gave them the autonomy to manage their own social and religious affairs without the intervention of the Ottoman Empire. So when the Ottoman Empire was dissolving, this millet system was surprisingly impacted the nation building process. When defining their nation states, these new nations defined themselves as religious Greek Orthodox in that regard, Christian, And whoever is not Christian or Greek Orthodox, Jews, Muslims, were expelled or they forcibly moved to the Ottoman mainland. And when we come to 1923, we see a country in both sides of the Aegean trying to establish their strong nation building process and the idea of a homeland. And this is when we see that again, religion becoming the main source of the nation building. So in the Lausanne Treaty, I'll just very quickly what it meant for the how to define who belonged to what side. So as from 1st of May 1923, there shall take place a compulsory exchange of Turkish nationals of the Greek Orthodox religion. So they're not saying Greeks, the Greek Orthodox religion established in the Turkish territory, and Greek nationals of Muslim religion established in the Greek territory. So there were Muslims, not necessarily always Turkish, could be, Pomaks, it could be other Muslim identities. They were exchanged, not necessarily speaking Turkish or speaking Greek either. This was mostly Venizelos' idea, because it's also, there's a labor aspect of this. Greece needed labor force, and the Greeks who were in Turkish territory at that time were the quite skilled labor force. They were artisans, they were highly educated, so it was going to be an incredible human capital. And Turkey lost an incredible human capital when all the Greeks left Turkey, and the Turkish population that came from Greece, but not necessarily all educated, mostly villagers. So this kind of created a human loss from the Turkish side. And that has to be, I think, recognized. But despite all these issues, as I mentioned, this was a topic that was not necessarily wanted to be discussed or wanted to be acknowledged. Until I think very recently, surprisingly, till the 2000s. Like people like myself suddenly have the courage and the interest in touching base with the population exchange, trying to understand, not to accept the Lausanne Treaty as it is, but trying to figure out why it happened, how it happened, what was the background of these discussions, how did we come to 1923, the first state-organized population exchange. It was through an international convention, and one has to recognize that this is state-organized, because mostly displacements can happen without the involvement of states as well. But it was also compulsory, and it was also on both sides. They tried to use it again with Greece and Bulgaria, seeing it as a template to exchange the population, but they didn't go through because of various reasons that I'm not going to go into. But through this, what we can see is that with the issue of identity, national belonging, these are the topics that nowadays younger researchers are more interested in. And this is a topic in the last 2 decades or so. Even in my time in Oxford that I was doing the research, I redirected from my original topic, which I was working on, Europeanization of migration policies, this and that, back into the 19th century. And I remember my supervisor at that time telling me, Michelle, you went all the way back to 100 years ago, but I said there's a continuity. In order to understand what is happening in the 2000s, trying to understand the issue of citizenship, identity, belonging, we need to go back and see what happened before 1923. And he said, well, wonderful, but focus on your thesis. So, well, I spent 6 months working on this, and I found it extremely fascinating, and I published an article afterwards. But going back, but this is a spark, and I really have to thank Renée about this, because that spark came to something that I think is so part of the discussion that one has to start, like touching a topic that has been understood as it is, but basically going deeper. I think what I would like to have is a visual thinking, not a criticism, obviously, that I wish Dr. Hirschon that we have a time machine and we can go back and in 1970s, and it was possible to do a comparative analysis that you have done in Kokenia and versus the Turkish Kokenia, I don't know, probably Basak in that regard. And to see what are the commonalities and differences that these people had. Because looking at through the archives and studies, when I was looking at the population exchange, as I said, what has been planned by the states was not necessarily always implemented. All these, we have to keep it in mind that it was an also issue in economic and financial rights issue nowadays, the social rights, economic rights. These people were deprived from their land, they were deprived from their properties, they were deprived from all their belongings and ended up having a rug or a coffee cup. Okay, so to sum up, what I would say is that everything that has been studied is extremely relevant. Unfortunately, we're still seeing the issues of displacement. Unfortunately, we're still seeing in the last year or so, we have seen Ukraine, and we're seeing Israel and Palestine as a whole issue of displacement and the discussions on homeland, who owns land, who belongs there, who doesn't belong there, the issue of identity, the justification issue. As we can see that this is a topic that is always relevant. And in that regard, I think this is an important contribution that we have to cherish more years to come, because it's not the Greek catastrophe. I think it is a human catastrophe, as Hirschon might also put forward, that it impacted both sides.
Thank you very much, Antony. Just on one point that you raised, you described that what you were talking about as a catastrophe, a disaster, I can't remember precise words. And it made me wonder whether there are any mitigating circumstances which one should consider. And talking to Greeks about the Greek side of the disaster, the mitigating circumstance often mentioned is the fact that they were able, through the population exchange, to populate Macedonia and other northern areas of Greece with a compact population which was able to ensure the security of the country, whereas before that point, this had been difficult or impossible. I just want to leave that thought with you. We've had two very interesting addresses from Professor Cohen and from Basak, and it's time to move on to questions. I don't know, there isn't a limit of time, or is there a limit of time?
20 minutes.
20 minutes for questions.
Yes.
We'll see that we don't exceed that. So in calling for questions, I know you're not a technical advisor, but is there anything we have to bear in mind as regards those who are listening on Zoom? How do they?
If there's a question, then I'll let you know online. If there's a question, then I'll repeat it for you on.
Okay. All right.
We'll probably start with questions in the room.
I think that's
to
probably
get it
best.
underway.
We'll start the questions in the room, but it can then go on to those who are following on Zoom. So, first question from David Martin.
Thank you very much. Renée, thank you. Fascinating. Indeed, thank you, all of you. Fascinating presentation, really good. Renée, can I ask a question about where you started? Anonymity. I can see the reasons for anonymity in looking into refugees and migrants, etc. But on the other hand, it goes against one of the fundamental principles of history. You're trying to establish the facts. So when does anonymity slide out and facts come in?
Thank you for the question. Just to put it in context, I was working under the junta and being followed. And consequently, it was more of an issue to be confidential about people at that time. So when I deposited my thesis here, the Bodleian put it under restriction for 10 years. It could not be accessed unless I gave permission to respected people.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee, but it was a very special event for all of us at the European Study Center and CSOX, and thank you for your gift to the discipline, because through you you made the voice of the refugees a science and a discipline, and what I want to say from personal experience is that what's interesting about the Greek case is that although often, with this issue of displacement, we don't get to hear the voices of refugees because they're considered something like second-class citizens. In the Greek case, their voice was heard a lot through their music, through their stories and everything. And then what I would like to ask you in particular is that your starting point is the 1970, and then you look at the continuity or rupture since then. But what about the before the 1970? How do you engage with that period from the 1930 to 1970? Because it wasn't kind of a stable kind of period. And I wonder how you engage with that particular kind of a very long period as well. One more thing to say about Basak's comment on the Turkish experience. It's even more surprising that it was considered just legal, but that was not the only case of displacement. Turkey is a country of displaced people, basically, all of them coming from the Balkans. So there was such a rich experience before. But even, that's a point about Turkey, but even in our own disciplines as well, how we see, that's not a question, that's a comment.
Only one comment. Thank you very much. Could those who, so far we've had questions from the boss class at the front, could those who have questions identify themselves, because we need to know who you all are if you're asking. So, next question. Yes.
Hi everyone, my name is Kira Garzi. I'm a postdoc at LSE, but old friend of CSOX. And it's really a great pleasure to be here in this event and also work a bit with Renee in the past. And yeah, it's a great event and a great occasion. So Renee, you gave us a great sense in the talk of what happened to the place over time. I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a bit more about what happened to the kids of these people. Did they kind of mingle with the rest of the Greek population in Athens? Did they stay there? Like, what kind of jobs did they do? Are they still distinct as a subgroup?
Well, my datum is the work I did living in that community. So I presented figures on their economic lives, their employment, their strategies for making a living when things started to improve for them. And the men had certain strategies, and it was always informed by the desire for self-employment. They don't want, the minute it's come to policy, you don't want anybody over your head. And that was also something that characterized the lives of women who were forced to work. It was not considered to be a good thing, but they would prefer to have jobs where they didn't have a housewife telling them how to clean the house. They'd rather work in a bank early in the morning, 5 o'clock, and they could clean the bank and go home and nobody would toss them around. So I found that this qualitative approach came out of just living there. One got to know what it was that their values were. Of course, they weren't entirely static as a population. And people, right from the beginning, would try to improve their conditions by moving out. But what happened was the unresolved titles to property kept people stuck there because they believed they would get compensation. And that compensation would come out of the original Treaty of Lausanne, where both countries would pay a compensation to the population that had been expelled. And in 1930 to 33, Venizelos made an agreement with Ataturk to cancel out whatever the Turks ordered or owed to the Greeks. And so whatever these people had, actually, they showed me papers saying this is what we had, in Antalya, and we're not going to get anything. It's just paper now. It was all cancelled out. That actually cost Venizelos quite a lot in terms of support in the elections, and it also accounts for the rise of the Communist Party in 1933 when they got into parliament. So that is actually in my work, even though, as I say, it was restrictedness in its scope. I'm not sure I answered the question.
I mean, I wonder if you have some anecdotes of some kids of some trajectories of kids of your friends, kind of, not, I mean.
Read the anecdotes in there.
Good.
All in the book.
That I have published, because I used case studies of the men I knew when they told me why they had changed from working in a factory and bought a trikiplo, a 3-wheel transport thing. And they described to me the advantages of being, or advantages of what is the other. It's mainly transport because you're independent. You can make your own hours.
Can you
Yes.
respond to my question as well? I asked a question about the pre-97 Renée. Is that a snapshot of the time, or do you consider the previous time as well?
No, well, that was the other thing about my story. I was thrown into this sort of situation in 1970 when anthropology was not equipped to deal with history. And I knew that I had to do it because people were talking about what had happened in the 30s, what had happened when they moved into the area. So I had to reconstruct their history through the way they told it to me, plus going back to records. So I did actually, again, I think, I hesitate to say this, but I was provoked by my publisher to describe what was innovative about my work. And that was one of the things that was innovative at the time. And I know that anthropologists here were much younger and more up to date with things. It wasn't usual to deal with history at that time, because it sort of sliced through the time we lived at that period. So my work actually did have that dimension. Chapter 2 is called The Ottoman Past in the Refugee Present. And that was a reconstruction of what they remembered. So there's memory studies coming into the way they identify themselves.
I'll come to you in just a moment, but I want to pick up on something you said about anthropology and history. And the perfect example in bridging anthropology and history is your and my supervisor, John Campbell. Do you want to say a word about his influence on you, insofar as he had an influence, or that of others, predecessors, on your work?
I think at the time when John was my supervisor, he had, I don't want to use a sort of like compartmentalized. Anthropology is one discipline, one methodology, and history has a different one. And he didn't bring them together, or he would have pointed me in the direction, I think, of what to do with these people who had a memory and wanted to talk about the past. So that's why I felt I had to invent my own solution there. With all respect, John Campbell was the most important influence, and he set me on a path which I could never have anticipated as being as fruitful as it was. And there is a backstory to why I landed up in Llewellyn-Smith, which I can't tell you now because of the time, but it all has to do with me not being allowed to go to a village. And because it's just my second choice. And he said, don't be silly, you've got a great advantage working in the urban area because you already know these people, you know about housing, etc.
Yeah,
Your
thank
question.
you very much. Yes, and thank you, Renée, very much. It reminded me of our conversations with you and with Barbara, and one of these were great times. I have a question. Did you know? Did you touch upon the issue of connection between the conditions way of integration and grievances in your book, or it's beyond it, what happens? Because, you know, we are discussing a lot now, the populists and how they're using the grievances, very often very well integrated diaspora. So is there any connection between the way how various groups were adjusting in this new place, or strategies which would lead to sort of, different
I
outcomes?
think I tried to illustrate it with that one slide.
Yeah.
About their strategies for adjustment, which were the maintenance of continuity. And they did that through marrying within the group and were disapproving of people who married out. Or it just happened like that. I mean, one of the examples, when I went back to the same area I've known very well, and people who were neighbors before were now in-laws and related to one another through marriage. So that happened because of proximity. And because they also felt familiar with their own ways, they had these marriages, which I contrast with the fact that divorce went up because there was more freedom to choose your partners, and consequently that was, if you like, the breakdown of the institution of marriage. The various groups who adjusted their, it's like a sort of a Russian doll, you know, you take bits out of them. So as Asia Minor people, they all had the same approach vis-a-vis Greek society. But within it, as I mentioned, there were stereotypes depending on which region you came from. And even in the second generation, they would tease one another and say, I know you're a Smyrnian, you're a very porous and difficult person. Or you're from Pontus, that means you're slow and ponderous. You know, you might have heard of those. I don't know if that's answered you.
Do we have any questions from?
None online, but I think there are two more here.
Right, Marilyn.
Thank you, Renée. That was wonderful and very rich. So you mentioned that by the time you were writing your book, refugee studies did not exist as a discipline. And just to emphasize your contribution, I would add that also memory studies did not exist as a field by the time. It was only in the mid-2010 that the ideas of memory and identity and belonging were revisited in relation to the specific literature. So through your ethnography, you provided us with a very in-depth account and a very diverse account of Asia Minor refugee memory and identity. And as you said, your ethnography is rooted in a very particular historical context. And different Asia Minor refugee generations are embedded in different historical contexts. It seems that over time, refugee identity passes through continuities and ruptures and silences. And the key theme of your presentation was, or one of the key themes was the theme of continuity. But I was wondering whether you could tell us more about ruptures and silences.
Thank you for that question. It's something that's come to my mind very recently when I was at the conference on urban ethnography and on the Armenian genocide. And it struck me that people who are disappeared through genocide have a silence around them. And who accounts for that silence? And I can't, in my case, can't answer that question because the silences were not ones that I was peering into. I'm afraid I had a very non-intrusive methodology, which was to sit and listen and absorb things like a sponge. Just whatever was thrown at me, and I just wrote masses of notes, and then I analyzed them. So that is also what came out of the whole book that I'm writing about now, which are the existence of coexistence of Muslims and Christians in the late Ottoman period. And the phrase is, we got on well with the Turks. Why did they say that? You know, so I've got a lot of stuff on people saying that, not elicited from me. How did you get on with the Turks? So they would say that. And then I'd say, but you lost X, Y, and Z, your family, your children, or whatever. And then they'd explain what was so good about the cosmopolitan heritage that they had.
There's a whole literature in Greek on getting on with the Turks. And a lot of it is fantastic. You know, it's been created to serve a purpose, I think. I think this will have to be the last question.
And
The second last question.
Myself, some of the others, I'm not visiting PhD student in history, though. I'd like to take a little bit of a personal angle here because I happen to grow up in the neighborhoods you mentioned here that, so you posted a photo of Panayitsa earlier, which was one of the main streets of Mikia, and I happened to go to one of those evening schools which were still in operations in the 2000s, by the way. So what I wanted to get at is that, and I grew up in Mikia in the 90s and in the early 2000s, and by that time, all those identities of the different refugee groups that had come to Mikia had kind of crystallized a new local identity, which had this sort of local pride in being from a poor slum and from having humble beginnings. And I always wondered how far back did this go, and when did this local new identity become crystallized? So I was wondering whether this was something you had encountered in your fieldwork in the 70s, of being in Mikia and of being from Mikia.
My experience from people who lived there was that they had a distinct sense of superiority over local Greeks. And that they could document it. They would say to me, these Greeks don't know how to cook. Look what they do. They make bacalhau and porta, you know, salt cod and greens. Or they know how to speak. They read. They're illiterate. They are literate. These peasants who move into the towns don't know how to deal with money. So there were all sorts of things which I had actually documented. I put them into the book in the first edition in Greek phrases, so you can check my Greek if it's right or not. But that's what I was, if you like, impressed by their superiority, which is what I stayed with. Okay. Yeah.
It's very interesting because at the top of the Greek pole, if you can call it that, Venizelos himself, the reason for his policy of liberation was to get a more sophisticated and more working population into Greece. And this chimes with what you were saying. Last question.
Very quick question. At the very end of the video you showed, there were images of people reading the Greek translation of your book, I think. I'm wondering what they shared with you in terms of what they thought about the book.
I never had a seminar on the book, I'm afraid. But we had a wonderful book launch. When it came out in Greek, I had it locally in that area, not in the university or in Athens or whatever. So I invited all the local people, and there were pictures of the time that I had been there, which I showed some of them on the video. And we had a presentation in which they all said to me, it's so good that you came and kept our words alive. And the thing that they felt was that without somehow me recording what they'd said, it would have all disappeared. So that's, been, I suppose, despite being, pretty ancient and decrepit, I really feel I can't give up actually. Keep talking.
Renée, thank you so much, and thanks to our two speakers also on the panel. We have to stop there. I'm sorry if other people have questions, but we've run out of time. However, we're going upstairs to have a drink and a nibble or whatever, and there'll be opportunities to talk up there. So thank you very much indeed.